This is Uncollared, off-the-cuff conversations between three progressive pastors at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture. I'm Todd Leonard. I'm senior pastor at Glendale City Church of Seventh-day Adventists. In a moment, I'll be joined by Shane Kinnison, senior pastor at First Baptist Church of Glendale, and by Galen Gobin, an ordained minister with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Today's conversation revolves around the tension between individualism and collectivism. I hope you enjoy today's conversation.
The last couple of opportunities we've had to talk, we have discussed some matters related to independence and the idea of autonomy, perhaps even individualism to some extent. And today would be a great opportunity to take a deeper dive into that with one another. I'd like to be able to do that from some kind of a theological and historic framework that's actually my framework. So I can't quote anyone on this. It's my framework based on my own observation. I would like to at least put out in front of you to consider these layers or movements that I sense that get us to sort of where we are today. From the longer lens of history, I see the outworking of freedom. And freedom, as I see it, freedom is founded primarily on the Imago Dei, the image of God, in which, as we believe in Judeo-Christian faith, is the essence of our created being, that we are all created in the image of the Creator. So the Imago Dei as the foundation of freedom, and then upon that foundation of Imago Dei is built, at least for those of us who are of the Christian faith, is the Christocentric work of Christ crucified, buried, and raised from the dead in order to make us free. So we have an innate freedom designed by the Creator who has created us in the image of God. We have a purchased freedom, a redemptive freedom that comes from Christ crucified and raised from the dead who makes us free, so that even the Apostle Paul would write sometime later, it is for freedom that we have been made free. Therefore, let us not be enslaved any longer to any former bonds or chains of slavery. So we have been made free. I see how that freedom has worked itself out in ancient narratives, through historic narratives, all the way, let's say, from the beginning of the church, in the death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the coming of the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, and the movement of the church across the known world. That would then lead into, for us it's considered ancient, but that would lead into more contemporary eras of the movement of the Reformation and Protestantism and separatism, and they also would undergird the very tenets or beginnings of the Enlightenment period, so that freedom is that which moves us into enlightenment. Enlightenment moves us into independence. Independence is that idea of outworking freedom politically, socially, in human contracts and social contracts. Think of all the centuries and perhaps millenniums in which people experienced freedom innately and freedom perhaps in faith, but were not able to work out that freedom because they were under totalitarian rules or dictatorships or supreme reigns of various kinds of kings, right? Then you move into the Enlightenment period, whereby freedom is actualized in social and political and economic structures and strategies and institutions. So that by the time colonial America becomes of age, enlightenment, that is, independence, has already set the groundwork for what would become revolutionary for us, the revolutionary period of capturing our own sense of independence and then moving forward as a country. Then the question becomes where independence goes from there to here. And that's where I have seen over the last 10 to 15 years what I believe is a strong presence of individualism. So going from this deep, what I think is a deep root of freedom, both innately and theologically, to this foundation of freedom, which birthed the Republic, to this now movement of individualism and hyper individualism that may be offshoots of this former freedom and former independence, but is moving in directions that may not be in keeping with such rootage. I'm by birth and native upbringing, I'm Texan. And I don't know of a group of people on the face of the earth more independent than Texans. I'm also a Baptist. I'm a Baptist who follows Christ by faith. So that takes me into a very deep taproot of the Imago Dei, a very deep taproot of the Christocentric work of Christ crucified and raised from the dead, and the outworking of that freedom in the independence that is in Baptist life, which we call our Baptist distinctives and our Baptist fragile freedoms. Anything from soul competency to the autonomy of the believer, the autonomy of the church, and the separation of church and state as the best form of religious liberty. So that's who I am. Moving forward, I leave Texas, I go to the Pacific Northwest, just a few miles outside of Portland, Oregon, and all of a sudden, I am introduced at all turns and spheres of life. I'm introduced by a mindset that I don't recognize. And I spend several years in Oregon trying to identify that mindset till I finally realize what it is. It is individualism, and it's a hyper sense of individualism as well. So it's individualism even to the extreme. And then I go from the Pacific Northwest to Southern California and living in Los Angeles County and still sensing that there is that individualism expressed here, but not to the degree as I found it expressed in the Pacific Northwest. But this put me on a mental trajectory of trying to discover what was this and from where does it stem? And I think it is a continual outworking of this movement of freedom to independence to individualism, which leads us to this conversation today.
The freedom that we find, that we're taught through the scriptures about our inherent dignity and our set free humanity that we find in the death and resurrection of Christ, is really revolutionary teaching and theology, because it really does undermine an understanding of a strata of there are the ruling class and the merchant class and the blue collar and agricultural class, and those strata are cemented in where they are, and you do not move between the levels. I think we can still see some societies around the world even today that still function very much on a caste system, where there is not to be movement between those castes, that a society is set upon a caste. And what we see in the theology of the Hebrew prophets, and then in the person and the work of Jesus, is this to make a pun, I guess, is to recast the understanding of our humanity, that we are all equal in the eyes of God. And there is, as Paul famously said in Galatians, there's no slave or free, there's no one nationality or another nationality, all are one in Christ Jesus. That is revolutionary freedom. And then to see that down the line into the Enlightenment period, where democratic independence forms, these are good things. What we're seeing now is it seems like the journey is taking us past what is good. We've passed a good understanding of freedom and independence, and now we've moved into this realm of an individualism, which is, maybe we would say, a perverted sense of independence or freedom.
Yeah, it is the grand extension of that, that brings us to, you know, in essence, as the world, I think I might say it this way, in essence, as the world gets larger for many of us, in that sense of freedom, for many of us on the other side, then it has to get smaller to include, so that I feel safe again. Has to include only those people that are, you know, like me, and which breaks down community and breaks down that sense of that others are as that others are a part of that and have that same freedom as I do.
So let's look at the mask mandate. The mask mandate has brought forward or accentuated perhaps a fissure that already was in our culture. And that fissure can be represented by those on one view of life who feel like the government is always trying to impede on my personal space, my personal freedoms, and my personal independence. On the other side are those who would view that the mask mandate is simply a way for us to collectively care for one another, watch out for one another, protect one another, and help one another succeed in order to defeat this virus that is taking down the world and all of those in it. So the mask mandate shows the fissures that perhaps are already there. And maybe the word fissure is not the right word, but it's a divide perhaps between those who cherish independence and want that independence at all cost, and those who cherish community and are willing to give in order for community needs and community objectives to be fulfilled.
Yeah, it is interesting to me, and this is I guess the struggle that I have, and the struggle with the topic as well, Shane. I don't understand why, stepping back a little bit from your freedom to wear a mask that will then hopefully help others remain safe and healthy, why that is viewed as a bad thing. I mean, it literally it's a very hard conundrum for me to understand that. Mm-hmm. That my sense in my own world, is more important than the broader experience of this. And this, what we're talking about. My dad, when I was growing up, you start learning in elementary school about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and things and all of that. My dad said, yeah, he said, but you got to remember that your rights end where they begin to infringe on somebody else. And I've always, I trust my dad. I love my dad. My dad was pretty smart and things, but that seems to have some wisdom to it for a communal experience that we all have to be together in. And living today in not only just a global society, but just in our communities, you have to understand that there are other people. And and that seems to be lost on the people. To me, that seems to be lost on people who fall into this hyper individualistic culture. And I literally have a hard time understanding that. Is there not, to you, somebody outside of your group, your family, your friends, that your actions can impact. It really just really disturbs me, and I really struggle with it. And I want to say to them, have you ever been driving down the freeway and somebody that you have no connection to whatsoever, maybe a half a mile in front of you, has an accident, and all of a sudden the freeway comes to an absolute dead stop? That's called communal living and communal experiences. So if everybody does and obeys the traffic laws and drives in a thoughtful manner or whatever, thinking about other people, then we'll have less of those, we hope, so that the community moves and functions better. And I don't know of anybody that would argue about that no, my right to drive, as my cop friends call it, HUA, is bigger and broader and more important than, and for me to get to someplace is bigger and broader and more important than the communal experience of all of us getting to our places safely.
I remember 9/11, and I remember that in that time, people pulled together, and even though our ultimate militaristic response was the wrong decision to make, but there was a time where we understood New York, we're all New Yorkers. There was, now it's New York is a dirty word for people on the right, but on 9/11, everybody was a New Yorker. Everybody was with the men and women of that city, and we rallied around them.
And Rudy Giuliani was the nation's mayor.
That's right. And I think there was something there about the leadership of the country at that point. I mean, you saw Republicans and Democrats speaking with one voice. We need to come together and be together. And I think there is something different about even in the last, I think, Shane, maybe what you said, 15 years, where now leaders are no longer now times of crisis are another place of trying to prove your point about which political ideology you need to follow. And so leadership has changed, and not even this is prior to Trump. This you can't blame this on Trump. This was prior to Trump, that this rugged American, not independence, but individualism can't be sacrificed at any cost. And that, in fact, and you've heard this, you heard it from the lieutenant governor of Texas. I just want to say, since our podcast is 6 weeks old, how Texas gets into every conversation we have. I just want to point out my slight annoyance that two of the three of the people on this podcast are from Texas. It seems like we're a little bit Texas.
I didn't wear my burnt orange today.
Listen,
I almost did, but I looked otherwise.
I'm sure glad you didn't.
Sure would love to have some conversations about other states, frankly. But honestly, Texas is a great example of this problem. I think the lieutenant governor of Texas said,
Dan Patrick.
Yeah, he said, I think our grandparents are willing to die for our state to be prosperous.
Yes.
And so we are willing to die in order not to have our freedoms to produce money and earn wealth and do whatever we damn well please. We are willing to let some people die for that. And people are going to be willing to die for that because that's the American way.
So we are referencing an article that probably will be on the screen, and we would recommend it to anyone who would want to read it. Let's use that article for a few brief moments to sort of go the next step up from that base layer of the mask mandate to, again, what this means as far as philosophy and is concerned. The article suggests that there basically is a movement afoot among us that people are either individualist or they're collectivist, and they're not necessarily one or the other. I always appreciate when we get into these conversations remembering the words of Dr. King, who reminded us that truth is never in the thesis or the antithesis. Truth is always somewhere in the middle. So we're not here to create a further division between people by suggesting that one way of thinking is right and one is wrong. Instead, we're taking Dr. King's approach of trying to find wisdom and understanding and truth somewhere in the mix. So I just simply say that as a precursor to this idea of individualist and collectivist. Individualism is a social theory that elevates the freedom of the individual over the collective. Most individualistic societies value uniqueness, independence, self-sufficiency, and autonomy. And we may not disagree with any of those characteristics. Individualistic cultures like the US place individual rights and self-reliance above all else. We celebrate and honor personal achievements, often assuming that success comes chiefly to those who wanted and worked harder for it than others. Personal relationships and the needs of friends and family trump the need of strangers. Collectivism, so on the other side, is a social theory that elevates the value of relationships and connections between people, known or unknown, as guiding factors in individual identity. Collectivists adhere to "we're all in this together" mentality. We're all in this together, believing that the needs of the group supersede the needs of each individual member. Collectivists generally value selflessness, working as a group to solve problems, always doing what's best for society, and placing community above all else. Now, let me just stop there briefly and simply say, in an observation fashion, that what put me on the trail of this observation and discovery process when I was in the Pacific Northwest is early on, I began to notice that people were in great difficulty learning how to come together and tackle larger group problems. And I began to wonder, where does that come from? What is this? What is the barrier or the obstacle that is keeping people from truly cooperating? And I began to realize that it might actually be this hypersensitive individualism.
I think somewhere along the way there's been a memory lapse and amnesia to what the scriptures also say in regards to our freedom, is that in our freedom we have the choice, we have the opportunity, and in fact God calls us into voluntarily serving one another. That we actually have this privilege, this honor to become like Christ, to actually descend and to do the work of helping another person when the burden gets to be more than one person should have to carry. And it doesn't mean that we all have our responsibility to carry our own weight, but we all face times when the weight, the burden is more than any one person can bear, and that's when we're supposed to come together. And it is our privilege, it is our joy, it is our distinct honor at that point to be the person to come along and help. And it is still the same principle of voluntarily leaning in to make sure we do good on a macro level. It is still following the same principles. That a government agency has to run it does not make it unchristian. It does not make it opposed to the person of Christ. That it takes a system, an organization to run it. It's owning the fact that on scale, on issues of scale, like a pandemic, like massive unemployment, that we have to choose to lean into that on a broader scale, and we need systems and infrastructure to run that. It doesn't make it unchristian or unbiblical.
I think that part of what gets lost is many of the ones that wouldn't have to make any changes and give up anything are the ones making the decisions. And when you start getting down to the micro level, where, one-on-one, I am going to have to make some changes in my personal understanding of who that person is, what I have and do, what I can expect from other people. And, the human ego doesn't want to do that. It doesn't want to make changes. It likes stasis. It likes being comfortable. That's why we will choose to continue to watch either, CNN or Fox News, because it keeps feeding my own understanding of things. And of course, it's those people then that need to change and are wrong. I could love going back to what you said, Shane, about Dr. King's words. It's not the two sides, it's in the middle. And it's when the two sides communicate with each other, instead of yelling at one another or name calling one another, that then truth can come out and truth can move forward and truth can be born and understood in the new context that our world today requires, that any new world requires. We have to talk to one another and be exposed, so that now we find, much more of the rightness of the reality of the direction that we all need to go.
The middle ground is so important, and you'll never find, this is the thing about these two philosophies, collectivism versus individualism, is collectivism can go way too far. And then it's interesting that either direction, either towards individualism or collectivism, individuals can be harmed, even killed, in a system that is too extreme on either way. It is going to be in that tension between the two, where the best system for as many people as possible, while maintaining freedom for as many as possible, exists. And so it has to happen between those two poles, not beyond one of those poles. You're not... Right. You got to stay somewhere in the middle in that tension between the two.
In this movement of perhaps independence to individualism, there seems to be this absence or this loss of cooperation, that in independent settings where people are independently operating, cooperation truly is the glue that holds all the parties together, all the people together, right? It's cooperation. It's the highest degrees of cooperation and mutuality that you can find and that you can function within. What happens in this movement into individualism is cooperation sacrificed for this all or nothing power grab, this scorched earth phenomenon of I'm taking everything, I'm capturing everything. And so it becomes very controlling and very power-based. Independence always demands cooperation. Individualism demands pure power.
It's liberty versus libertinism.
Yes. Another point in the article that you might find interesting, the author suggests that it may also have to do with location. The key to real estate is location, 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 right? That there are locales, and locales have various philosophies or points of view or way of working things out. And so the author is suggesting that individualism is more prevalent in rural areas, while collectivism is more prevalent in urban areas. Using the quote that says, you see higher rates of individualism in places like Montana and Wyoming than you do in Virginia or Pennsylvania, because you've got denser populations with institutions. Let me just make one more quote and maybe we can discuss it. The author quotes one who was doing some research in this area, and the researcher indicates that the United States refers to the United States as a weird population. Now, you may agree with that, perhaps, just that one statement. WEIRD, weird population, that stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. I find that really interesting description, that we are a weird population, basically Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. When we draw generalizations regarding Americans, we're usually talking about this very limited weird group that is not representative of everyone. You can still identify lots of folks who are high on collectivism within the US. So that there is this individualism in the United States that could be referenced or described as weird. And yet even in that description of individualist, within it are pockets or populations or communities of collectivists who are more prone toward the group than the individual.
You look at the cultural variety. We bring in cultures that are naturally more collectivist, and then there are cultures that are more naturally individualistic. There is an interesting. It's not so much a blend as, I think. Did we talk on this podcast, or I've heard somewhere else say, comparing the United States not so much to as a melting pot as to a tossed salad. That that we're not all blended into one broth or one stew. That we're a collection of different ingredients that mixed all together make this delightful this delightful salad. And so we have cultures in our country that are naturally drawn to a more collectivist practice, and that was even referenced in the same article, Shane.
And that's why I think the author would even suggest that both societies, individualist and collectivist, both societies have their admirable qualities.
Yeah.
And there are strengths in each camp, so to speak.
Well, and one of the things that was interesting, and I was trying to find it in the article, author talks about that there are strengths in both, and there are times that each side functions as the other.
Right.
And, which in some ways might be the place where we could begin to find the common ground to communicate, as Dr. King asked for us, is to find those spaces and times when each would function as the other, and to start the communication there in an effort to bring this, to bring a conversation about. It's the rugged individualistic community in Montana, Wyoming, or something like that. But when everybody knows everybody there, and before you spit on the ground, everybody knows about it. That's not individual. That's pretty collective, because the stuff works together. And yet, we live in a collective. We have these apartment buildings. We've got people that are doing workspace together and are doing share space together and spending all their time together, that are not vulnerable in any way, shape, or form to somebody in a particular way, where somebody might be able, they might be able to support and help in a difficult time. And the one who's wounded, injured, suffering doesn't feel connected enough to go and ask for that. So that was one of the things about the article that really struck me, was the beauty of each one of them is needed on all of it, to correct the extremism that each one of them brings, like you were talking about, Todd.
Right.
We need one another's viewpoints, because, like I said, I can't figure out why somebody thinks that it's such a horrible thing to put on a mask for, a 1 hour walk through a mall, a shopping experience, or something like that, and then come back home again where you don't have to wear the doggone thing. What's the big deal of discomforting yourself for that? Maybe we could start that conversation in those places.
The question becomes, how do we really relate with one another? And how do we find that working common ground, that mutuality that we seek, that not the synthesis or the antisynthesis or the thesis or the antithesis that Dr. King spoke of, but finding that truth in the middle? And is that still possible? Perhaps we can wade into that question in our next time together. Is it still possible to find that and discover that for the good of our culture and community? Or are we on a precipice? Are we already on a slippery slope? Are we already on a downhill slide by which this might become a self-fulfilling prophecy for our country and culture? I think that we need to sit with that next time and discuss that with one another.
We hope you enjoyed today's conversation, and we would love to get your feedback. Please email us at uncollaredpodcast@gmail.com. You can find our podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also watch our conversation at YouTube. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter by typing in Uncollared Podcast.